Hi everyone. Might just give ourselves another quick minute for a few more people to join, but thank you so much for joining us for the How to Amplify Leadership Development in a Hybrid World webinar. My name's Vicky and I'm from the Myers-Briggs company. Today's webinar will run for about an hour, so due to the amount of people that we've got joining, we will keep everybody on mute to avoid any background noise coming through, but we do encourage your participation by using the questions box feature on your GoToWebinar panel. So feel free to submit any questions throughout the session. We want this to be as interactive and engaging as possible, and I'll be assisting with any questions and comments that we do get throughout. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions during the webinar, we will be sure to do a follow-up afterwards. So first, a little bit about the Myers-Briggs company. We're a mission-driven organisation with a 65-year history. You can see on the slide that our mission is to inspire everyone to lead more successful and fulfilling lives. We deliver on this through our talent identification and development consultancy services, and also by offering certification in trusted psychometric assessments for those practitioners who want to bring the capability in-house. You can also see on this slide that we are a certified B Corporation or B Corp. This means that we have gone through an official certification process to be recognized as a socially responsible organization. There are around 5,000 organizations globally, large and small, that have done this, and we think it's a good thing and encourage you to learn more about it. So our presenter today is Dr. Martin Bolt. He's the Senior Director of Professional Services and Psychologist at the Myers-Briggs Company. Martin has 2 decades of experience helping leaders enhance and adapt their leadership for today's changing workplace. He's engaged by businesses in Australia and internationally to support executive and middle managed leadership development. He also works as a faculty member for executive MBA programs, and he has recently been a guest on ABC's Radio National The Working Life podcast, and has also recently been a guest on the Myers-Briggs podcast, where he shares insights for leaders in today's hybrid world. So just a reminder that everyone who has registered for this webinar will receive an email in the coming days with notes, a recording, and free resources. And I'll go into those free resources a bit later on in the session. So with that, I'll turn over to you, Martin.
Terrific. Thank you, Vicky, and welcome everyone. I've just switched on my camera just so you know that I really am here. I'm running the session live with you, and for those who joined live, great you could make the time to do that. I won't actually leave my camera on the whole way through, but I'll bring it back on as we go towards the end with some questions. So welcome everyone, and thanks for joining. And I just wanted to probably highlight that again, as a topic that we've seen very important, but also its importance is represented through the number of people registering for our webinars. The theme here has a hybrid theme, a hybrid work theme today, as some of our other webinars have. But this one in particular, we're looking at what it means for leaders working in more of a hybrid workplace. So we'll touch on some new ways of leading that have emerged because of the need to work in a hybrid way, more and more of us. We've also got some initial research, and it's early days, but how high performing organizations are developing their leaders for this hybrid world. And I did want to share with you some ways to help leaders develop their skills, in particular with a hybrid workplace in mind. And I'll also share with you an example where we've done some of that leadership development work with an organization so that you can see what it looks like in practice. As Vicky mentioned, we'll also share with you some tips and also some complementary resources at the end of our webinar today, so that for those who'd like to take this further and forward, you've got some things to work back to. We also want to make it an interactive experience like many of our other webinars, so please be ready to jump in and share your thoughts and participate as we go through the session. I did want to probably just get us to think about, where we've been and where we are now in a matter of a couple of years. So the world of work really has transformed for many people since 2020, and hybrid work has become the norm for those whose work permits or allows for that. And I do want to say from the outset, not everyone's work or organisation allows for hybrid work, simply because there are some jobs and occupations that require people to turn up on site to go to a workplace. So we need to keep that in mind. But for many people, including myself, hybrid work has become the norm, the combination of doing some time on site with people in a workplace and other parts of the week working more remotely or virtually. And leading people in a hybrid workplace is turning out to require a different approach to leadership. Hybrid work is not going to go away. In fact, on all measures so far, it's here to stay and is probably becoming a norm for those who have already started working that way. And what a number of leaders, in particular managers that I do work with and do consulting services, a lot of them are saying that the sort of traditional ways of leading, examples, management by walking around, moving around the workplace, seeing people in action, people coming up spontaneously, having conversations, or where a leader might wanted to spontaneously call a team meeting and get people together in a room. These sorts of things are just not as possible in a hybrid workplace. So it's really asking leaders to think of what are some other ways that they can keep engagement, keep commitment, keep connection happening between the people they're working with. And this is really presenting some new challenges, but also some opportunities we wanted to keep in mind for leaders and organizations, which we'll explore today. So here's the chance to start getting involved in our session today, and we're going to launch a poll here where you have a chance to respond. So the question is, what impact has hybrid work had on leadership effectiveness in your organization? And you've got a choice of ratings there, from a very high impact, a moderate impact, minimal, or no impact. So again, we're keen to learn from yourselves, those who've joined today, from your experiences of seeing leaders in your organization or organizations you're associated with. What impact has hybrid work had on their effectiveness as a leader? And again, when we've got some results coming through, Vicky, I'll ask you just to share with us what people have said in terms of degree of impact.
Yeah, great. Everyone has been quick off the mark. So currently we've got very high impact coming in at 13%, high impact in at 41%, so that's the highest. We've got moderate at 35%, and minimal impact at 10%, and 1% no impact.
Great, excellent. Well, first of all, thank you everyone for sharing your own experiences there, and just maybe putting together the very high impact and high impact. It sounded like it was approaching about 60% when you put those two together, Vicky. Would that be about right?
Yes.
Yep, okay, well, there you go. So that very question that you've answered there today is a research question that was asked very recently as well by a leadership development research group. And what they actually found when they surveyed over 800 organizations is that 63% of those organizations reported that hybrid work has had either a high to very high impact. So we almost matched the results there today for our group. So the experience sounds like it's a common one. So with that understanding that there has been a high to very high impact in leadership effectiveness, some further research done by the Centre of Creative Leadership, they actually found, well, if there is less opportunities for some of those more pre-pandemic or traditional ways of leading and interacting, such as spontaneous face-to-face interactions, what is some of the outcomes of that? And there is already starting to emerge some adverse outcomes in terms of people's sense of belonging. Not only belonging in terms of the people that they work with, but feeling like they belong to a wider business organization. So that's starting to be affected. Also, the research found that there was an increased number of people feeling that they were disconnected, or ultimately just not connected to where they're working and who they're working with. And the flow-on effect of that is reduced engagement. People just feel less involved with what they're doing, and also diminishing commitment. It actually means more and more people are less loyal or less committed to where they're working, because it's turning into more of a remote transaction that people are experiencing. So that indeed is going to, and is presenting some interesting scenarios for leaders as to how to address or reverse the some of those challenging effects of hybrid work. And it is worth identifying that there are challenges, but also opportunities when it comes to hybrid work. And this is early days, but here are some of the initial challenges and opportunities that we're starting to see. So when it comes to challenges, particularly for leaders, one of the first things that many of them are sharing with us is that there is a limitation on terms of being able to observe and have a shared work experience with the people they're leading. And a lot of the shared work experience comes from being co-located, working on things together, experiencing even just a similar work environment with each other. As people have been doing more work remotely, either from their own houses or different locations, even the work environment experience is different between leader and their employees. There is a growing risk of proximity bias. Some of you may have heard of this, but this is the risk that those people who are spending more time in the same physical location as their leader tend to get considered more, their input gets utilized more by the leader. And in fact, there is even starting to show some signs that people who are physically closer in location to their leader, the leader's more likely to promote or develop them than those who are working more remotely. Another one is leaders are still trying to work out, when do we bring people together to collaborate in person, and when is it appropriate to do that virtually? So it seems like there's a bit of a balancing act going on there. There still is, because the research hasn't come through yet, but a lack of reliable and proven solutions for leaders to know that they can confidently rely on when leading others in a hybrid environment. And a big challenge that is still coming through, it started obviously at the beginning of the pandemic as people worked remotely, but has continued on with hybrid work, and that is the capacity to build new relationships, particularly with new employees, but also maintaining relationships and connections with existing employees. So there are some of the challenges, and maybe worth for those joining our webinar today, if any of that resonates with you. When it comes to opportunities, though, there are also some opportunities that leaders are identifying and seeing with hybrid work, and that is there is greater flexibility and better work-life fit, not only for employees, but a lot of leaders are sharing that same experience as well. A number of people have highlighted that the benefit of hybrid work, particularly when they have chances to work remotely, is that it allows for deeper work. This is where people can deeply concentrate for a lengthy period of time without interruption on important work. There's an increased access to virtual talent to be able to tap into people or new employees or co-workers in different parts of the world, because it's now accepted that people can conduct a lot of work at times virtually and also collaborate virtually. A number of leaders are also highlighting that it's resulted in new ways of working that people would never have previously attempted or imagined, as well as servicing clients or customers. There is a growing understanding that more customers are willing to engage with their service providers virtually, because that's what was expected for the last couple of years. And of course, producing work has changed in a hybrid environment. We don't necessarily always have to have people sitting in the same room all the time. That's resulted in some leaders seeing the opportunity to develop themselves to lead people in new and different ways than what they might have previously done. So when it comes to those opportunities, maybe have a think about, are any of those opportunities that you're seeing as well for leaders in this more hybrid working model? The other part of some recent research that I thought was quite relevant for our topic today is a group for Training Magazine, the annual leadership development survey, which has been conducted for a number of years and includes over 800 organisations, asked people to identify what are the priority leadership skills that leaders need to have in 2022. So from a lengthy list of leadership skills, here were what the top 5 emerged for 2022. And I'll come back to, there has been some change in recent years as to what makes it into the top 5 and relative importance. But top of the list, you can see the majority of organizations are highlighting leaders need to be more effective in coaching and developing the people they lead. So there's more of a developmental focus that leaders need to bring to the workplace. Communication skills, which by title is a very broad area, it's really highlighting though that leaders still need to be highly effective in communicating, certainly two-way dialogue, but finding new ways of communicating that previously they may not have had to draw on in more traditional ways of working. Leading teams is again in the top 5 and has been there for a while, but still remains there as an important area. Emotional intelligence and leaders understanding their own emotions, as well as being aware of the effect of emotions with other people, is important. And the 5th most important was strategy development and alignment. How do leaders not only pinpoint and develop strategies that are going to work, but get people aligned around that? Now, when we also looked at this year's survey results, they found that there are a number of leadership skills that are important, but their relative importance has actually changed in the last year. So areas like leaders being able to take accountability or build accountability, creativity and innovation were still important, but not as important as previous years. Creating engagement had dropped somewhat in importance. Diversity and inclusion, it still came in at number 6 most important, so just outside the top 5, but its relative importance had shifted since previous years. Similarly to change leadership coming in at number 9, but had dropped in importance. Now, it's not to say that these other areas are not important, but their relative importance for many organizations is decreasing compared to the top 5. In looking at the results in the wider survey, something else struck me is that out of all the leadership skills that had the greatest relative increase in importance in 2022 was interpersonal skills. And this really jumped up quite a few rankings for leaders, coming in at number 8. Now, if we link interpersonal skills back to the top 5, you can see that many of those leadership skills are very much focused on the relational and psychological part of how to lead people. So that importance of having effective relational and psychological skills of leaders has in many ways probably increased in the last couple of years. So what does it look like in terms of what successful organizations or high-performing organizations are doing to develop their leaders? And again, from the same research, what they wanted to evaluate is from the wide range of organizations that they had been surveying, what were some criteria that indicated the organization had effective leadership development? That is, where they'd invested in leadership development, did it actually have a positive impact for the leaders and the organization? So here were the 6 criteria they used to benchmark the organizations. The first criteria is that their senior executives of the organizations recognized that leadership was a competitive advantage, and hence they needed to invest in it, support it. Otherwise, the performance of the business wouldn't be reaching its full potential. Another sign was that competitors were directly targeting that high-performing organization's leaders to recruit or attract them. So that sort of headhunting approach. Also that high-performing organizations were attracting high-potential leaders from other organizations. So they had people wanting their people, but also they were attracting people to their organization. They also pinpointed that a high-performing organization doesn't have gaps in their leadership capacity, meaning their leaders could move or adapt to different situations that called for different styles of leadership. Point 5 is that these high-performing organizations actually invested both time, resources, and budgets to leadership development. It wasn't something they did as a sort of afterthought. And the sixth criteria was that the high-performing organisations had a leadership bench that was strong enough that if someone or some of their leaders left, they had leaders in waiting who could replace the departing leaders. So they were the six criteria that were applied to all these organisations that were using leadership development, and they essentially categorised the organisations into either high-performing, moderate, or low-performing. So let's hone in on the high-performing organisations. And there were some common themes that the high-performing organisations had, particularly when it came to learning methods. Now, one of the most striking things in the 2022 findings was that when it came to leadership development, the high-performing organisations still had a high percentage of their leadership programs instructor-led or led by a facilitator, but a greater proportion of the time the instructor-led sessions were being run virtually or online. Now, these were live sessions, often described as being synchronous, meaning the facilitator or instructor is live in the sessions with the leadership participants. But naturally, there's been a shift to doing it more virtually rather than in-person classroom learning. They did acknowledge that these high-performing organisations tended to blend some virtual and in-person sessions together. When they looked at other learning methods, what they had in common was that they expected their leadership participants to apply their learning in action learning assignments. And these included real world work projects, work assignments where they were applying their learning back in the workplace, that these organizations all consistently used assessment methods, helping leaders assess their own leadership, but also incorporating feedback from others through 360 feedback, that they made available and created opportunities for job rotation where their leaders could move between different job roles or even different parts of the organization to expand their leadership experience. They had active involvement by the most senior leaders in the organization, particularly in supporting the learning methods. And one of the key activities that senior leaders were playing a part in was mentoring those going through leadership development. And as I mentioned earlier, that the instructor-led sessions were a combination or a blend of in-person and virtual. So you may want to think about some of the leadership development methods that you're using or have experienced in your organization and see if any of them map back to some of these high-performing organizations. Now, there are some very key and common and reliable ways of helping leaders develop skills for a more hybrid workplace. So what I'll share with you now is some of these methods, but also to link it back to a case study or an example where we actually use these methods. Now, when working with leaders, and this has been the case both pre the pandemic and since the pandemic, I often ask them to think about it's important to consider not only who they are, but where they're leading and the kind of people they're leading. So the starting point here is we start with the leader looking at themselves, their own beliefs, behaviors, strengths, and blind spots. And this is what each leader has the most influence over, their own behavior, their own choices, and also their own attitudes to what it means to lead other people. The next perspective that leaders need to consider is, who am I leading? What are the needs of my followers or staff? What are their preferences? What are their motivations? What are their responsibilities? And really, what is it that I'm trying to help them engage with, get motivated by, or even inspired by? This is an area that leaders have some influence over, particularly their direct reports or direct followers. But even then, we're dealing with other people. So there's only a certain amount of influence a leader can have. Then the final area is their environment. What's the context or the organizational environment and the business environment that the leader is working in? And this is where leaders really need to step back and think about, what is this organizational business trying to achieve? Where do I fit within that? How much can I influence choices and decisions there? It also means that there's only a limited extent to which a leader can influence the wider environment. And depending on where a leader sits in an organization, the more senior the leader, they might be able to play a more active role in shaping the broader context or culture. A middle level leader or an entry level leader might have less influence over that. So it's helping leaders really recognize if there's only limited influence on certain parts of the environment, not to invest or overinvest their development trying to change that. And I have seen some leaders who are very successful in one organization or one particular role, but as soon as they change organization, the things that made them successful in one place are actually like a derailer or a handbrake in another place. So that's why self and the environment becomes important. Now, for a moment, though, consider there's lots of emphasis on helping leaders develop, but how do any one of us actually learn about leadership? How do we learn to be an effective leader? Is it through reading books or watching YouTube videos or going to a one-day conference? Well, if you step back and think about it, we get ideas from that, but we really don't learn about leadership simply through those kind of methods. And think about other skills or abilities that we're trying to develop or enhance. If we bring it back to another skill, such as learning how to play a musical instrument or how to play a particular sport, we can read about it, watch experts performing. We can even go and see what they're doing and read their methods. But in the end, we have to actually experience it and try it out ourselves. We learn those skills, be it musical or sporting, through trial and error, going out on the field or into the studio and experimenting. Leadership is no different. We learn leadership by doing it. Leadership involves using instruments and assessments and methods to get clear about what a leader or what we as a leader need to do. But then we actually need to take it out and experiment with it, because leadership is a psychological process. We can't just read about leadership and then assume we understand it. We're dealing with live human beings at the receiving end of leadership. And as we all know, human beings can be unpredictable at times. So that's where leadership development really needs to incorporate a dynamic learning experience. So if we come back to the top 5 leadership skills that have been identified in particular for leaders in a hybrid era, I found an article recently written in Harvard Business Review called What Leadership Development Should Look Like in the Hybrid Era. And I thought they had a good way of framing up what are the ways we help leaders learn. And some of this is embedded in longer standing leadership development research, but it also has an up-to-date currency for our current era. And in that article, they highlighted that an important starting point for leaders is self-discovery. We need time in leadership development to help leaders become aware of who they are, what's their leadership identity, and get a good, clear sense of themselves. We also need to build into the development experience sense making. This is where leaders get exposure and opportunities to learn new ways of thinking, doing, and even new mental models about leadership. And the final piece is experimenting on the job. This is where they take the learning or insights from self-discovery and sense making and apply it to their actual context. So this is something that we factor in when we're running leadership development, but I also encourage you to think about how does your leadership development offerings align with those 3 foundations. Now, to come back to another opportunity for everyone to participate in our session today, we're keen to get a bit of an understanding for those who've joined. Which learning methods is your organization using for leadership development? So in this poll that Vicky's going to launch now, you'll have an opportunity to nominate more than one if necessary. But we just wanted to get a quick read of some of the common methods that are being used, be they psychometric and 360 feedback assessments or coaching, group workshops, be they in-person or virtual, job assignments and projects where your leadership participants are actually applying the learning back in the workplace on a designated activity. Or another option is completely self-directed online courses where a leader takes themselves through the experience in an online setting without having to interact with other people. So I'll just give a moment for the responses to come in, and Vicky, when we've got some results, that'd be great to hear them.
Great. We currently have 12% psychometric and 360 feedback assessments,
Mm-hmm.
25% for coaching,
Mm-hmm.
30% for group workshops, in person or virtual. So that's actually coming out as the highest at the moment.
Okay.
23% for job assignments and projects, and 13% for self-directed online courses.
Okay, fantastic. So again, thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts there and experiences. Again, it's great to get a sense of what people who are in this space are seeing or experiencing when it comes to these different methods. And yeah, it looks like group workshops is a common one of the most common ones, followed by the coaching and learning assignments. And that's, again, really great to see that learning assignments, there's a good percentage there, although not everyone who's tapping into that. So great to see that there is a bit of a spread. But bring it back to the starting point, and this is probably the self-discovery piece, which is where all leadership development needs to begin. It's helping leaders become really aware of, at that point in their career, how conscious are they or aware are they of their interactions and their relationships with others, but also their internal states when they're leading other people, when they're having a success or a challenge. What's going through their mind? What's their views, their beliefs? What are their emotional hot buttons? All of those factors will shape whether a person is aware or unaware of their impact as a leader. So here's a framing of an approach of using combinations of learning methods, both assessment and active learning, that I'll take us through, and then I'll share with you where we've used this with an organization and a group of leaders. When we think about planning or scoping our leadership development approaches, we think of it as a bit like a staged model, a staged process that leaders step through or step up through the stairs, starting with the most basic level of self-awareness, which is helping them understand themselves as they see themselves through a personality lens. This is where we use a tool like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which measures people's personality preferences and ultimately their personality type. And it's a safe and constructive place to start in leadership development, because it helps leaders understand, who am I and how am I different or similar to other people, in particular the people I might be leading. As those who are familiar with the MBTI will be aware, there is no better or worse MBTI type in leadership. In fact, all personality types can be effective leaders, but each personality type approaches leadership differently. So with that, leaders can then move to the next level of understanding themselves, or the next lens, which is their interpersonal skills. And leadership does require interpersonal skills. Sometimes people assume interpersonal skills only happen when we're in the same room or space with a person, but as I'll show you in a few moments, that interpersonal skills play out in a wide range of interactions, including in the hybrid world. And the FIRO assessment is a well-regarded measure of helping leaders identify their interpersonal skills. Another lens that leaders need to become aware of is their emotional intelligence. And this is EQ, or emotional intelligence skills, become important not only for developing themselves, but also when it comes to developing or coaching others. And we saw coaching as one of the priority skills for leadership development at present. And the final stage of self-awareness is leaders getting an understanding of what's their impact, what's their effect on the people they are leading and working with. And this is where I'll share with you an example that we use the Centre for Creative Leadership's suite of 360 leadership assessments that give leaders that gauge and insight into how they're being experienced as a leader. Now, what I've got there is a bit of a picture of different assessment frameworks or models, but assessment is only one part of leadership development. What becomes also important is the experimenting part of it. So this is where, as our leadership programs incorporate a range of different learning approaches that we found essential for a well put together leadership experience. So there are leadership frameworks, and that can be delivered through instructor-led sessions where you're providing the new frameworks, new ways of looking at the world that leaders can pick up and take. The team or group learning becomes essential because that's where leaders in a safe environment get to practice some of these new skills, new behaviors with each other in a dynamic way. Coaching, be it one-on-one or with a group, enables leaders to take their learning but have follow-up opportunities to review or readjust their learning actions and be supported doing that. And as we mentioned earlier, job assignments becomes crucial as well. This is where we ensure that the leadership programs are not done in isolation, but the output is that the leaders are working on a live business issue or a leadership issue that they can apply their new learning. So this is where I wanted to give everyone an example of where we've used some of those approaches with an organization, a leadership development in action. So this was an organization we've been working with in the last couple of years, a healthcare provider. The organization had a group of leaders. Some of them were new to new into the executive leadership team, and there were 6 executives, but all of them were new to leading in a hybrid work environment. Now, for this organization, they actually had a mixture of staff. Those that were working in more office or corporate roles had moved to operating in a hybrid environment, but they also had services where they had a percentage of their staff who still had to turn up on site to do their work. And they were finding there was a bit of a mismatch or a challenge between those staff that were working hybrid and those that are working on site, and the leadership team were having a bit of a struggle knowing how to navigate or work with that. They also acknowledged that they were at a loss to work out what are some of the new ways they need to adapt their leadership for a hybrid working environment, because many of them had really not led in that way prior to 2020. They had picked up that there was some emerging conflict or tension in parts of their organization or disengagement by certain groups of staff, and they wanted to address that. At the same time, they were positioned and planning for quite rapid growth in the number of clients they were servicing, but also the range of services, and they had to find new staff to meet those growth demands. The good news was the board of this organization were very supportive of helping this group of leaders develop. They recognized that it was these leaders that were going to help take the business forward, and so they also were supportive and recognized the importance of them investing in some leadership development. Here is a bit of an overview of the timelines and the kind of broad activities that we used as part of the leadership development process. So the very beginning of it was to understand more about the organization. So we spent time with the senior leadership team, got some day in the life understanding of what was on their plate, how the business was operating, but how they were fitting in with the business. Because we wanted to evaluate any change in their leadership approach and effectiveness, we also asked the leaders before they had done any learning to complete a leader pre-survey on some leadership and behavior outcomes that we reevaluate at the end of a program. And also because we recognize, and the leaders recognized, that they needed to get a read of where staff were and where some of the common sources of tension, but also where sources of satisfaction were. We instigated an employee survey to help inform where the leaders needed to focus their development. So that took us about 2 weeks. And then the first month was the self-discovery phase, where we introduced leaders to learning assessments about themselves, taking them through guided debriefs. But that then led to learning together in group workshops. So we were able to find time where we could run a combination of in-person workshops and some online virtual workshops with this group of leaders. And that was essential for them to socialize their learning and have a shared experience. They weren't learning about their leadership by themselves. We did note that it worked successfully in this particular case to run the first leadership workshop in person. That created a safe, trusting environment for leaders to open up and get to know each other. The subsequent leadership workshops, we were able to switch those in virtually as needed. We also want the leaders to not only just have some self-discovery, but to think about what are their personal learning goals and actions. So we ask them to pinpoint an individual leadership assignment they wanted to work on. So that period of time took us a month to work through that. Then the next phase of the program was sense making and experimenting. So this is we're providing the leaders with some new frameworks, some new ways of thinking about their leadership. But then as a leadership team, we asked them to pick a current business challenge or project that they could work on together to actually also make use of the learning from the program. And again, that resulted in some follow-up workshops. And to support their learning, once they had started applying new methods, new approaches, we provided a series of online individual leadership coaching sessions where leaders were able to step back and say, out of the new approaches, what was working for them, what was not. And what was also important, because this was a team, was we provided a couple of team coaching sessions where they're able to review the success or progress on different business projects. So that was about a 4-month period of time to take them through that. The final stages was reviewing what had or hadn't changed in the program review. So we asked them to complete the leader survey that they had originally done in the first phase, but to do a comparison between pre and post. And we also reviewed other outcomes from the program, including some of the staff feedback. So you can see it wasn't a one workshop or a one-day session. It was something that was embedded in their work together over a number of months. And that's what they said helped bring the learning to life. So when we take a close look at some of the learning frameworks that we took them through, starting with the MBTI, this is the first thing they experienced going into the leadership programs, where they assessed their own personality type and got an understanding of what it meant for them. Now, the advantage of using the MBTI framework is we could link it back into multiple learning methods throughout that leadership development program. So they were able to use it with each other in both team and group learning to learn about different personality types and how they interact and work with each other. It became a framework for their one-on-one coaching, where they could, with the coach, work out which parts of their type were helping them, but which parts were holding them back and how to adjust. And also we spent some time linking it back to research on personality type and leadership. And it helped them understand how different types might show up in leadership. Now, when you think about what the MBTI brings to leadership, it's a useful starting point in who I am and who are the other people I'm dealing with or interacting with. So our group of leaders in this program reported that they got an increased awareness of their personality type, but more importantly, how it linked to how they lead other people, how they prefer to communicate, different ways of approaching a decision, and also how to use that knowledge when coaching other people, particularly people who might be different to themselves in type. It also enabled the leaders to explore their types when they brought their personality types together in a team profile. And again, because this was the leadership team, that became an important team development activity, almost like a side byproduct of the leadership development program. They were able to also find within their peer group people that they could mentor or co-mentor each other. And a simple way they use the MBTI here was to look for people in their team who were different in type or type preferences, and to spend some time working through work decisions or leadership problems and getting a different perspective from someone with a different type. And they found that helpful to broaden their perspectives. And ultimately, we wanted them to link it back to a current leadership challenge. So all of the leaders had to pinpoint a leadership challenge, work on it, and bring it back to the group sessions and report in how they had to help them or where they needed to change things. The next lens that we took them through was the interpersonal lens with the FIRO. And again, the FIRO was used both in team and group learning, where we helped them explore and actually experience different interpersonal needs in a group setting, but also linking to their one-on-one coaching. Now, some of you may be familiar with the FIRO, or indeed our webinar last month was on the topic of interpersonal needs, and in particular, how the FIRO assessment adds to that. But to do a very quick recap, the FIRO measure looks at three interpersonal needs that all people express to some extent, and all people to some extent want others to offer them. And for each of us, we have our own level at which a need is satisfied, where we're not giving too much or not enough. Now, the three core needs that the FIRO measures is the need for inclusion, which picks up on to which groups or relationships do I want to be part of or involved. Control, which looks at to what extent do I need or want to influence other people, or how much am I open to having them influence me. And affection, which looks at to what extent and with who do I want to build a strong, close personal connection. Now, all of us have these three needs, but for leaders, it helps them to identify what of these three needs is most important, and also at what level are their needs satisfied before they start leading other people. And there's some excellent supporting resources for leadership development with the FIRO, where it helps leaders not only work out their interpersonal needs, but how that might affect their preferred leadership style. So for the leaders where inclusion is their most important need, they take on a role as a leader about getting involvement and clarification from the people they're leading. So that often looks like a leader bringing people together, be it in a virtual or in-person meeting, and creating an environment where there's lots of contribution. For leaders where control is their most important need, they're more comfortable taking a director role. And in those moments where decision-making or structure needs to be part of what a leader is offering, these leaders are comfortable providing that kind of structure, or also working within a structure that might be given to them. And for leaders where affection was their most important need, their leadership style is more focused on building harmony, support, and loyalty with the people they're leading. So leaders here are good at building close connections with their staff. Now, all leaders can exercise all three of those needs, but helping leaders work out what was the most important to them helped them work out what they also needed to pay more attention to, particularly when it came to their followers' needs. So the takeaways for the interpersonal needs was that the leaders got a better understanding of their own interpersonal style, but also how that might play out with their follower relationships. We use the FIRO model to also help leaders get clear about where people might click or clash with others based on interpersonal conflict and how to resolve that. The leaders also used it as a peer mentoring approach, and we asked them again to use the learning about themselves from the FIRO with a particular leadership challenge, a staff member that they might be struggling to work with. The final steps were incorporating the other two lenses of self-awareness, which is the EQ, a leader's emotional intelligence, and finally, their leadership impact, which is where they invited 360 feedback from people they were working with. Again, these two assessment frameworks were integrated into the other learning activities of looking at leadership frameworks, coaching, and applying it to job assignments. The emotional intelligence was measured by the EQI 2.0, which is one of the longest standing measures of emotional intelligence and is being used quite extensively for nearly 2 decades in leadership development. So our leaders in the program not only got an understanding of where their underlying and current EQ strengths and development areas are, but we got them to think about which EQ skills are most important in their current job or indeed in their current organizational environment. And that's where leaders were able to pinpoint which ones they might need to adjust or work on. The leadership the report that the EQ generates gave some very customized strategies. So leaders weren't left guessing what it was they could do to improve skills such as empathy or flexibility or even stress tolerance. We asked them to integrate it into a current staff feedback or coaching activity where they were thinking about their own emotional skills, but what were the emotional needs of the person they were leading. And this particular group of leaders found the EQ quite helpful and illuminating with respect to their own approaches of dealing with pressure and stress. So there is a whole dimension within the EQI that measures stress management, and that gave them some insight as to some of the experiences of stress they had encountered, but also how to better manage that for themselves. When it came to the 360 feedback, what we were helping them finally get a picture of is, how do other people experience them as a leader? For those who are familiar with 360 feedback, you would know that it involves getting rater feedback from other people. If you haven't used 360 feedback in your leadership development processes, it's very powerful, but does require some effort and some coordination to do it properly. So we're actually inviting the leader to rate themselves on a set of leadership skills and capabilities. Those leadership skills and capabilities were developed by the Centre for Creative Leadership over many decades, evaluating what real leaders who are effective in the workplace need to demonstrate to be effective. And then each leader invited feedback from someone senior to them, a group of peers, their direct reports, and other people in the organization to see how aligned or maybe even misaligned their self-perception was with others. Now, 360 feedback is potentially the most challenging, but also the most rich in terms of self-awareness for leaders. And by this stage of the program, our leaders were pretty prepared for this feedback. What they got from it was a greater awareness of where their current strengths were, but also what they needed to focus on in specific leadership behaviors. It helped them identify also what was most important out of the leadership behaviors in their organization, because they got feedback from their raters as to what were more or less important areas. It helped them define leadership behaviors that they could target in role assignments. And the very fact of in asking people for feedback meant that the leaders were more comfortable and confident seeking informal feedback from peers, direct reports, and peers, direct reports, and senior leaders were also more open in that feedback because it had already been used in a constructive way. For this group, we were able to look at their collective 360 feedback and also identify what the leadership group had as common strengths and development gaps, which informed our leadership development program. So what were some outcomes for this group of leaders? First of all, they identified that all of them were able to apply their new insights in current work situations. It linked it back to real experiences they were having to deal with as leaders. As a leadership team, they actually were more comfortable and confident establishing forums to negotiate new ways of working, both with the hybrid and on-site staff. Rather than it being in the too hard basket, they felt prepared to have those conversations. Each leader had identified a next level leader they were going to coach and develop for future roles. The leadership team also targeted the staff areas of staff conflict and worked out what was contributing to engagement or disengagement and how to rebuild some engagement there. The board of the organization, as a result of the program, said that they had increased trust in this executive leadership team, that they were more willing to go with the executive team's recommendations, but also they observed that the team themselves had built more trust with each other. And the leadership team themselves found it a useful experience because it helped them get clear about their strategic and cultural focus in that particular organization for growth. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we like doing pre and post evaluations, and here were the criteria or the behaviors that this team of leaders were measured on before the program, and then again 5 months later after the program. And the good news is the ratings indicated an increase in all of these performance measures, which the team themselves were quite satisfied by, but it was also nice to see that there was some real change in the workplace as well. So hopefully that gives you an idea about a real world example of where we've applied a leadership development process using those different learning methods and frames of what's effective for leadership. But for those of you today who are in actual leadership roles, we did want to leave you with some thoughts and some tips that we're seeing as quite important in hybrid workplace. So for leaders thinking about yourself, define what's important and meaningful for you in your current leadership role. That will help motivate you to keep working on the things that are important. Think about how does the hybrid work fit with your own leadership strengths, but also where might you need to adapt your leadership. How can you remain curious and open to experimenting with new ways of work? Even think about the experiments you've conducted over the last 2 years and what did you learn from those in your leadership? And what aspects of your leadership do you want to keep? I remind leaders you don't have to change everything or throw every approach out. Think about which ones are still working for you. Now, as leaders, it's also important to consider the people you're leading when you're leading others. So think about focusing on building trust or continuing to build trust with the people you're leading. And one way of doing that is assume that your staff have good intent when they bring challenges or problems to you. Helping your staff and be curious and experiment with new ways of addressing challenges that might emerge from hybrid work and acknowledging that it's an ongoing experiment rather than coming to a final conclusion. And also leading people to develop them, not just managing staff, is important. And we also encourage you to think about learning about your own preferences and where they might click or clash with your staff and what you can adjust as a leader. So hopefully that gives you all some things to consider if you're in a leadership role, or maybe things to share with the leaders that you're working with. So before we take some questions, I'll hand to Vicky, who's got some further tips and resources and things for you to consider from our session today.
Thanks for a great presentation, Martin. So just to quickly recap what we've looked at today, we've looked at priority leadership skills for the hybrid work era, how today's high-performing organizations are developing leaders, effective learning methods for leadership development, how assessments and development activities guide leadership development, an interesting case study of leadership development and tips for leading self and others. So as mentioned, we do have some free resources for you. If you're interested in hearing more about the topic of leadership from Martin, you can listen to the latest episode of the Myers-Briggs podcast, where Martin explores how to foster the best connections with the people you lead, along with lots more information and advice. So you can either scan this QR code that you can see on screen, or you'll also find the podcast link on our latest blog post, and we'll also include this in the email that we send out to everybody post this webinar in the coming days. Another resource that you will also receive in that email is our 10 keys to successful leadership development. So this will be a download for you. It's multiple pages, and that will be in the email for you. If you have a need for some expert advice or an extra set of hands, we offer consulting services where one of our experts, like Martin, can get to know your organization and design and deliver a customized solution to meet your business requirements. We specialize in areas of leadership, team and organizational development, as well as talent assessment for selection and succession planning. This year, we've seen a real call for both virtual and in-person sessions with a focus on inclusive leadership as well as leading change for leadership groups. And in terms of team development, we are delivering workshops that relate to connection, change, and accelerating team performance in a hybrid environment. So for those interested in bringing capabilities in-house and to work with FIRO, we have a virtual session scheduled in December. Also listed are other programs that we have that are very helpful in leadership and team development. These do include the MBTI certification that Martin spoke to, as well as programs for emotional intelligence, 360-degree feedback, and career counseling. Our in-person certification programs have proven popular, so if you're keen to join us at either the Melbourne or the Sydney sessions in November, please book now as there's only a few slots left. So thank you all for those who have shared questions. I think we've quickly got time to maybe get one or two in, Martin.
Sure.
So one here is, what happens when a leader doesn't see the need for development?
Yeah, so a fair question, because not all leaders are either interested or open to developing themselves. And I guess the old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So it's a good reminder that development is an opt-in. We can create an environment where it encourages people to do it, but you really can't force someone who's not ready. One of the approaches I take if leaders are a bit unsure, reluctant, is to really get them to think about current role, what is working well for them, what's not, what's a frustration for them. but also to get them thinking about what's beyond where they are now. What are the things that they're wanting to work towards, be it in a job role or a leadership level of responsibility, and what they're currently doing, is that going to allow them or enable them to get to where they need to be? And I think a key thing a lot of leaders have learned, even if they're not entirely open to development, is in the last 2 years, all leaders have had to adjust in some way. I've also found that if the leader has peers who are engaged in that development, that can sometimes motivate someone to join in the same sort of development. But hopefully that gives a starting point for at least having a conversation about it.
Amazing, thanks. Well, we are sadly out of time. So if we didn't get to your question, we will look to follow up with you post this webinar. And yeah, we'll also send out those notes and resources and recording all to you in the next coming days. So thank you so much for everybody who joined, and thank you, Martin, for a great presentation.
Thanks, Vicky, and thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully that was of value to you. All the best.